is indeed an honor and a blessing for us to host one of the world's most noted, most renowned journalists, a broadcaster and author, Melanie Phillips. Those of you who follow her work know her for her deeply penetrating analysis of the current events, of the world scene, of cultural issues, the culture wars. I mentioned yesterday to a number of you her piece on the situation in the Ukraine as a good example, which she just posted recently, last few days. So I urge you to go to that and read her profound insights and analysis on that situation. She is Britain's most known, best known, and most controversial champion of traditional values in the culture wars. Her weekly column appears in the Times of London. It's been published over the years in The Guardian, The Observer, Sunday Times, The Daily Mail. She also writes for the Jewish News Syndicate. She's a regular panelist on BBC Radio's The Moral Maze, and she speaks on public platforms throughout the English-speaking world. Her first novel, brilliant novel, wonderful novel, this is the novel, it's called The Legacy, deals with the conflicted Jewish identity, anti-Semitism, and the power of history. It's published in 2018, along with her personal and political memoir, fascinating work, Guardian Angel. Her previous books include a 2006 bestseller, Londonistan, about the British establishment's capitulation to Islamist aggression, very important work in our time. She's the author of The World Turned Upside Down, The Global Battle Over God, Truth, and Power, published in 2010. I would urge you to follow her work, as I say, and her brilliant insights on her website. And you can go to her website at www.MelaniePhillips, that's with two L's, Phillips with two L's, MelaniePhillips.substack.com, MelaniePhillips.substack.com, Substack, S-U-B-S-T-A-C-K. And now, without any further delay, please join me to welcome our wonderful guest, our honored guest, Melanie Phillips. Melanie, please.
Thank you very much indeed, David, for those far too kind remarks. And thank you to your whole community for inviting me to speak to you today. It's a great honor and privilege. And I'm sorry not to make the virtual acquaintance of Rabbi Cohen. And I wish him, if he's watching at some point, a refuah shlema. But I am grateful for the opportunity to speak about this very important topic, which is basically, according to my title, the threats to the Jewish diaspora, to diaspora Jews, from both within and without. And it's a very complicated picture that I will very briefly try to paint to you. And I can do little more in the brief time available to me than sort of sketch out some of the main kind of chapter headings, as it were, of the analysis that I make. And I apologize in advance for leaving stuff out, and I hope that in your questions we may come to some of the gaps in what I've said, and I'm very happy to take any questions about anything really you care to throw at me, whether it's specifically on the topic or slightly off the topic. But to the topic itself, the threats to the Jewish diaspora from within and without. Now, I'm sure I don't need to tell you that we are living through an epidemic of really very brazen anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish feeling across the Western world, and indeed more broadly than that, if you take into account the Islamic world. But it's the Western world that I'm particularly concerned with today, although the Islamic world obviously has a great impact on the situation in the Western world. We are living through record amounts of anti-Semitism, monitored by our communal organizations in Britain, in America, in Europe, You know, the records being sort of broken every year, unfortunately, when it comes to both verbal and physical assaults on the Jewish people in the diaspora. Now, a couple of broad comments before I get into the weeds of all of this. First of all, as we know, anti-Semitism is not something that ever goes away, unfortunately. It is always with us, it always has been with us, and I'm afraid it always will be with us. The most that we can ever hope for is that it will be kept to a very low proportion. And unfortunately, at the moment, that is not the case. It is not at a low proportion at all, and it is being winked at, ignored, and even encouraged by people who are in a position to raise their voices against it, which would have some effect, but they are choosing not to. So the question is, why are we living through this particularly intense version of this ancient hatred, the oldest hatred, at this moment? And I think, again, a sort of general point I would make is that anti-Semitism roars out of control in societies which have kind of lost the plot as far as they themselves are concerned. They are confused about what they are. They've turned against what they are. They no longer want to be what they are. And, you know, the Jewish people, for all kinds of reasons, has been the traditional scapegoat for cultures which are themselves going down. It's often been said, you know, Jews are the canary in the coal mine, and I think that's absolutely correct. You know, bad as it may be, the situation for Jews themselves, their situation when the society turns against them carries a dire warning for that society as well. So I want to suggest why this is happening, and I also want to suggest that in my view, the biggest threat of all to Jews in the diaspora is actually within themselves, in losing their connection to Judaism, in failing to acknowledge the threats properly and where they're coming from, and even Jews turning upon themselves, or rather turning upon the Jewish people. So let's first of all, let's try and pick this apart, and let's look first of all at the threats from without, from outside the Jewish people themselves. And I would suggest that there are three sources of threat to Jews at the present. The first source is what I would call the political left. And I would include in that the secular left, that is to say, people without a religion, but also people who subscribe to the progressive churches, the progressive Christian churches in Britain and in America. And in Britain, the progressive church is the Church of England, which is the established church of the country. So the first source is what I would call the political secular left. The second source is the far right, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, that kind of person. And the third source is the Islamic world, Muslim communities, and also parts of the Black community, African Americans, particularly in America. Less so in Britain, but to a certain extent. And I want to touch on all these areas, and all these areas are intensely neuralgic. Well, one of the problems about this subject is that you can't have this discussion normally in non-Jewish circles in the West, certainly not in Britain, and you can't have it in many Jewish circles either, because these things have become unsayable, and that's part of the problem. If you can't identify what the problem is, you certainly have no hope at all in getting to grips with it. So let's just look at these sources one by one, briefly, I'm afraid. Let's start with the far right, because the far right gets the lion's share of attention, really, particularly when it comes to the Jewish community itself, particularly in America, as I read, but also to a large extent in Britain as well, that the main threat is considered to come from the far right. Now, this is simply not true. The far right, neo-Nazis and that kind of individual certainly are a threat. They always have been a threat. Our intelligence services, our security service in Britain certainly, and I'm I would imagine it's pretty well the same in America, tells us that that threat is increasing, the numbers are increasing, but nevertheless, they are still extremely small in number, and I think their influence is exaggerated by the fact that our mainstream media, which does not like to admit at all that anti-Semitism resides on the left or in any of its chosen, its designated sort of victim groups, as it were, it emphasizes the far right all the time. So you get a kind of distorted picture. But anyway, they are there. They are a threat. But in my view, they're not the biggest threat. The next section of the world population, which is a problem for Jews at the moment, is the Islamic world, the Muslim community. Now, the anti-Jewish attitudes there are absolutely virulent, and they are unfortunately extremely mainstream and common. We know that because all the opinion polling that's been conducted in Europe in particular shows that among the Muslim communities in the West, there is a wildly disproportionate number who basically hate or dislike or fear the Jewish people. Now, why is this? There are a number of reasons. First of all, in their religious sources, there is a great deal of anti-Jewish, theologically based anti-Jewish invective. Historically, Muslims have been less cruel and hateful to the Jewish people than the Christian world in medieval times, but nevertheless, it's been pretty bad. So religion plays certainly a part, and this has been given rocket fuel, if I can put it that way, by the rise of what I would call Islamism, which took place in the early 20th century after the Ottoman Empire collapsed following its defeat in the First World War. The sort of colonial imperial constraints that the Ottomans had imposed upon religious extremism in the Islamic world were lifted. And out of that liberation, as it were, came Islamism as we know it today, which was basically a return to the sources in the most fundamentalist and literal way, principally by individuals such as Sayyid Qutb. And if you look at those sources, you look at those individuals who are responsible for the Muslim Brotherhood, for the Islamic extremism that the world has suffered from for several decades, you will see that hatred and fear of the Jews, theologically based hatred and fear of the Jews, has been fused by those people with Nazi hatred, racialized hatred of the Jewish people, and communist hatred. And you can see the tropes of Nazism and communism fused, as it were, with theological Islamic Jew hatred. And so that gave the whole thing absolute rocket fuel. And today, that has seen its most pervasive expression, or not pervasive, but the format in which it has made most inroads into Western secular society has been through the Palestinian cause, because anti-Zionism cloaks what is basically fundamentalist Islamized anti-Semitism, and again fuses religious jihadi religious imperative to slaughter Jews and to conquer them and so on and so forth with a kind of Soviet-style approach, which literally turns a narrative inside out. And it's no coincidence that this has happened, that it has a kind of Soviet feel, because Palestinianism, if I can call it that, was concocted in the 1960s between Yasser Arafat, who then led the Palestine Liberation Organization, and the Soviet Union. And there was an unholy alliance. Arafat wanted to create an artificial Palestinian identity in order to fight and defeat Israel, which he couldn't defeat militarily. And the Soviet Union understood they could weaponize the Palestinians to basically twist the Western mind and turn it inside out and shift its whole, sort of knock it off its moral compass, which is, I think, what it's achieved to the letter. So that's a very brief way of describing a rather complicated process. Anyway, that's the Muslim world. So we've covered so far, well, we've noted the far right, we've noted the Muslim world. Now I want to just very, very briefly talk about African Americans. And as I say African Americans because we don't really have that problem in Britain, not to the same extent, to a certain extent in the Black community, but I feel that's sort of come in from America. And, you know, when I look at what's gone on in America, when it comes to the attitude among African Americans towards Jews and Israel, I think it's tragic. Because, you know, not so long ago, American Jews and Black Americans, African Americans, stood shoulder to shoulder in the great fight for Black equality in America. And now one finds these both narratives of hostility and fear of Jewish people and demonization of the Jewish people. And again, a disproportionate number of attacks, particularly on ultra-Orthodox Jews in places like Brooklyn, committed by Black people. And I think that, again, it's a complicated issue, but to a large extent, this is because the Black community in America has been so tremendously radicalized over the last few decades by the Black Power movement, and more recently, in an allied sense, by Louis Farrakhan's Nation of Islam. And I think the influence of those institutions, and crucially, the lack of pushback by the progressive elements in American society, which could have stopped it. They could have said, this is anti-Jewish prejudice and we're not having this, but they didn't. Because they thought that would be racist to say that. And we have that today even more so. And so that brings me on to the connecting factor, as it were, between the tragic adoption by so many African Americans of an anti-Jewish narrative with what's happened on the left. Because the left, the political left in America and in Britain, draws upon both Muslim and Black Jew hatred, which feeds into the left's dominant ideology of power. And I'll just explain that as briefly as I can, because this is even more complicated. But basically, the modern left has, over many decades, has been basically taken over, as it were, by a Marxist view of the world, even though there are people who, you know, would laugh at the idea that they were Marxists, because, you know, they subscribe to capitalism, they like, you know, capitalist way of life, they don't wish to overturn the capitalist way of life, but nevertheless they have a Marxist attitude, by which I mean, the great thing about Marxism was that it divided the world, or divided society, into groups defined by power. So there were the powerful and the powerless, and life was an unending struggle between these groups. And we see this very much today in the whole ideology of intersectionality, victim culture, identity politics, in which you have groups who are powerful and groups who are powerless. And basically the groups who are powerful are the white capitalist West, and the groups that are powerless are the brown and black-skinned developing world. And the brown and black-skinned developing world, because they're considered to be powerless, are considered to be victims of the white capitalist West. And because they're victims, they can basically do no wrong. And the white capitalist West can basically do no right. And here is the terrible thing. When it comes to the Jewish people, the world's ultimate victims, the Jews are not seen as the world's ultimate victims according to the ideology of the left, according to the ideology of intersectionality, identity politics, and all that. They're not part of victim culture at all. On the contrary, the Jews are part of the victimizer culture. Why is that? Well, the Jews are seen to run everything. They're seen to be so wildly overrepresented in finance, in law, in politics, in economics, in science, in everything. And consequently, they are considered to be the white capitalist West because they make money, and because they are seen to be the people behind the making of money. They're seen to be actually running Western capitalism. I mean, this is quite a stretch for a very small people, even one like the Jewish people, which is so disproportionately represented in public life. But, you know, unfortunately, at the heart of victim culture, identity politics, intersectionality, I'm afraid, is a profoundly anti-Semitic trope that the Jews run the world in their own interests at the expense of everyone else. And as a result, even more absurdly, the Jewish people is considered to be white, even when it's brown or black-skinned. So Israel, for example, which is predominantly brown-skinned, a small majority of Israeli Jews come from the Middle East, come from Arab lands, they are brown-skinned. 20% roughly of Israelis are Israeli Arabs, and then you have a number of black-skinned people. And consequently, the number of white Europeans, people of European origin in Israel is actually very small. Nevertheless, because Israel is powerful, why is Israel powerful? Because it has a military and it uses it, and because it's Jews and Jews are powerful. So it's this fundamental anti-Jewish terror of Jews with power, which is behind victim culture, it's behind intersectionality, and it's also threaded through the hatred of Israel. And there is also in this left-wing ideological dogma something which is even more perverse and quite monstrous, which is a jealousy of the Jews' victimhood. And it sounds too absurd, but I've heard it actually said in terms, and I can see that it's embodied in so much of victim culture writing. And people actually say this. They say the problem with the Jews is that they suck up all the victimhood in the world, and so there's no room for us if they're black or brown skinned. What does that mean? You know, this idea there's a kind of finite amount of victimhood in the world and the Jews suck it all up. What do they mean? And what I think they mean by that is this, that the monstrous nature of what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust, which they kind of know about up to a point, but they understand it was entirely monstrous. And it was so big, they feel that they can't sort of compete with that. There's it's a kind of zero-sum business, that there's a finite amount of victimhood. And so that's absurd enough as it is, but there's something even worse, which is that it's not just that the Jews are seen to suck up all the victimhood, but they're seen to play their victim status as a get-out-of-jail-free card. Now, what do they mean by that? They mean that the Jews play the anti-Semitism card in order to conceal what they're doing wrong. What are they doing wrong? Well, when it comes to Israel, you know, Israel is basically wrong in itself, goes the narrative, which is terrible, but you can understand where they're coming from. What do I mean? You know, the Jews in the diaspora play the anti-Semitism card as a kind of get out of jail free card. And what they mean by that, I'm afraid, is that they think that by crying anti-Semitism, they think that the Jews are covering up their innate evil. And what is that? Well, it's all the things that we know about. Running the world in their own interests at the expense of everyone else and all the rest of it. So at the very heart of victim culture is this belief that the Jews play a get out of jail free card through victimhood. And we, the identity politics people, are going to play it better. And in order to do that, we have to deny the real victim status of the Jewish people. Sounds awfully complicated, and but I do think there is a very twisted logic behind this in the kind of way I describe. Now, the heart of the left's various ideologies, identity politics and all the rest of it, is an idea which is absolutely inimical to Judaism. And the idea that's inimical to Judaism is universalism, the idea that the values that we most cherish are not particular to any culture, but are universally shared. Now, that is simply untrue. That is simply untrue because, you know, the West subscribes to values such as respect for every human life, equality, rule of law. These things don't exist in many other societies. They are not universal. They are rooted in a particular culture. They're rooted in Western culture, which is therefore better than other cultures. And we can't say that anymore. We can't say that these values are better than any other culture. We can't say the West is better than any culture because that's considered racist. So it's racist, therefore, to say that it is better to live in a culture which gives rights to women than a culture that doesn't. I mean, how ludicrous is that? And the other thing about these values that we cherish is that they come basically from, they were embedded in the West by Christianity, which is the foundational creed of the West. And Christianity got them from the Hebrew Bible. They are fundamentally Jewish values. This idea that they are universal is not true. And along with the universalism comes a sort of a parallel idea, which is that while values are universal, they're also particular to me as an individual. They're all about my right to assert that my personal autonomy can dictate everything else. So what I think is right for me is what is right. And nobody can tell me that my behavior or my values or my culture are any worse or any better than anyone else's. Now, this individualism is what's often called moral and cultural relativism. It means there are no absolutes. There is no such thing as absolute truth. Everything is a matter of opinion. There is no such thing as good or bad. It's just a matter of opinion. My behavior is no worse than your behavior. It's just a matter of opinion. And as a result, you get, through this moral or cultural relativism, you get an absolute dissolution of morality. Now, the Jewish people is all about morality. We invented moral codes which constrain our behavior in the interests of others. And that is at the heart of Christianity, and it's at the heart of the West. And therefore, if you have a creed of universalism or universalist moral and cultural relativism, you're going to have a creed which dissolves morality altogether. And then you're going to have not a moral universe, not a society governed by civilized values. You're going to have a society in which it's a fight, a tribal fight between the strong and the weak go to the wall. And that's what we're living through at the moment, and it's getting worse. And at the very heart of it, in my view, is an all-out onslaught on the values of the Hebrew Bible as expressed, as most people understand it, through the Christianity at the heart of the West. Now, unfortunately, a number of Jews have signed up to all of this, especially in the United States. It's a source of untold grief to some of us who think we can understand what's gone on here. But to this way of thinking among these sorts of progressive Jewish people in the United States, they believe that universalist values, which in my view are inimical to Jewish values, not only do they espouse them and embrace them, but they call them Jewish values. They call it tikkun olam, and it is actually the reverse. And this is a terrible, tragic misapprehension, which I'm afraid is taking a very large number of American Jews away from Judaism, and not just taking it, they're taking them away from Judaism, which is happening elsewhere in the West. It's happening in Britain, assimilation and so on, but it's actually turning Jews against Judaism in a kind of Orwellian fashion by telling themselves that actually their anti-Judaism is actually truly Jewish values. And consequently, you can't have even the conversation with them because, you know, it's a mind twist that's gone on. And again, another example of this terrible confusion of moral and cultural relativism, I would suggest, is what we have seen in America and in Britain in the a large extent of Holocaust memorializing that's gone on, both in terms of museums and memorials. And to cut a long story short again, many, if not most, of these memorials and indeed Holocaust education is about telling people that there was nothing unique about the Jewish element of the Holocaust. The Jews were simply one part of it. It was actually, you know, the Nazis murdered many other types of people. And, you know, the Jewish experience is only one of the experiences. Now, there is truth in this, in that certainly many people other than Jews were caught up in the Holocaust. The Nazis killed millions and millions and millions of people who weren't Jews. True, but that's not the point. The Jews were the only people who were singled out for extermination from the face of the earth. And that makes a difference. And it was the galvanizing ideology behind Nazism. So this idea that, you know, the Holocaust actually tells people, well, you know, there was nothing unique about Jewish suffering, and anyone can be a Nazi. Well, then you denigrate what happened. You denigrate the enormity of the Nazi crime, and you denigrate Jewish suffering, and you open the way, I'm afraid, to saying Israel can be a Nazi state. So just to try and bring my remarks to some sort of general conclusion, I would say that the question is what we might be able to do about it, because to a large extent, what I'm talking about is an irrationality, and we know we can't deal with irrationality by rational argument. I mean, you know, it's a sort of contradiction in terms. But I nevertheless think that although there is, it is at core an irrationality that we're talking about, there are many areas involved in this in which people's ignorance leads them to espouse anti-Jewish feeling, where in fact, if they had better education, they would not espouse it. And so I would say what to do about it. Well, you have to do, I think, many different things. First of all, I think we should actually stop talking about anti-Semitism, because I think the word has become so contested, and it's so it is so emotionally freighted that you know, you put people's hackles up immediately. It sort of gets in the way of the conversation. So that's a sort of word of warning. But I think that it depends who one is trying to influence. For some people, you know, it's a simply a matter of education about the Jewish people, about Jewish history, about the state of Israel, and particularly when it comes to Israel, to change the narrative so that people who think that, you know, people in Britain in particular, they care very much about the rule of law, about fairness, justice. This is imprinted in the British DNA. And unfortunately, they believe that Israel is on the wrong side of all this. And one has to start telling them some of the truths of history, which they have no idea about. They have no idea, for example, that Israel wasn't created as a result of the Holocaust, but actually the Jews were promised alone their return of their homeland after the First World War, on the basis that they alone, the Jewish people, had a claim to that land from history and from law. And people have, in Britain, I can tell you, people have absolutely no idea about that. And they are flabbergasted when you tell them, and you can see the little light bulb going off. It's a terrible thing, but nobody in the Jewish world tells them. Israel doesn't tell them. Our community leaders don't tell them for various reasons. So that's the first thing. You can get through to people who are well-meaning but ignorant by teaching them. But then I think you have to also be a bit creative, and you have to use the weapons of our enemies against them. Their weapons are demonization, character assassination, and making the Jews and Israel sort of different in a way that people disregard their suffering. And my view is that if one is defensive against this, once you play defense, once you're on the back foot, you've kind of lost the argument because you're on their territory. What you have to do is to use their weapons against them, but instead of using falsehood, to use truth. So you basically have to change the narrative by using language properly. So you say to them that they are racist, that they are supporting ethnic cleansing, they are supporting people who support Nazism in the Palestinian Authority. They are supporting people who oppress, persecute and tyrannize their own people in the Palestinian Authority, and so on and so on. You use their language with which they demonize us through falsehoods, but you use it with truth. And above all, we have to, as a Jewish people, start teaching our own children about Jewish history. I'm always staggered by the number of Jewish teenagers that I come across who have been through Jewish schools in America, and to a lesser extent in Britain, which doesn't have so many Jewish schools. But even in America, where they've come through Jewish schools, they're so ignorant about Jewish history and therefore so vulnerable to the narrative of lies. And, one of the great issues that we face is how we can stop our own people from turning against ourselves. I've tried to suggest in my remarks today some of the reasons why so many of us are turning against ourselves, but this is a really terrible thing. And in my view, it's the single greatest threat. If you look at our history, we were torn apart, and our greatest defeats came not at the hands of our enemies from outside the Jewish people. They came from inside, from the fact that we were not just divided, because Jews will always be divided. We always fight among ourselves, but crucially, we allowed ourselves as a people to tolerate people and that's what's happening today. And that is, in my view, the single greatest threat that we have to face. And it's the one that is the most difficult for us to cope with and to work out how to deal with it. So I will
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Melanie Phillips. Thank you so much. Those remarks run deep and wide and are brilliant. We have some questions for you, not surprisingly. If you have questions, please send your questions to me in the chat. We have a question from Jerry Patterson. She's asking, what people, if they spoke up against anti-Semitism, could actually make an impact? Can you identify individuals whose voices might carry that kind of weight?
Yes, I think that really all our cultural leaders, if they spoke up against it, would have a tremendous impact. By which I mean this, you will probably be aware of the tremendous trauma of the British Labour Party under its far left leader, Jeremy Corbyn. Now, that was an occasion where the Jewish community started jumping up and down, which they don't normally do in Britain at all. And the political class, the sort of mainstream political class, expressed horror at Jeremy Corbyn. But it was very limited in that what he and his ilk were saying was so completely, off the charts, anti-Semitic, that nobody could, possibly have doubted it. But they did not take the opportunity of then explaining to people about anti-Semitism. So even though there'd been this tremendous furore in Britain about Jeremy Corbyn and anti-Semitism, people kind of thought, yeah, anti-Semitism, that's about being horrible to Jews. And so it's like racism. And the Jewish community went along with that. They said it's a type of racism. But it's not a type of racism. It's not at all a type of racism. It's something unique. Now, the Jewish community flinches from saying it's unique. But, if you had, prime ministers and presidents and leaders of churches and other denominations and parliamentarians and people prominent in the professions saying, you have to see this in the context that, the Jewish people is a particular people. It has always attracted this kind of thing. It is fundamentally irrational, and it is completely beyond the pale. And it's being fed by, and you have to name who the people are feeding it. It's being fed by the left for these reasons. It's being fed by the Muslim world for these reasons. It's being fed by the anti-Zionist world for these reasons. And all these reasons are false. And anyone who subscribes to any of this, it should be a social pariah, basically. Now, no one says that. No one. So people are left baffled. What is this thing, anti-Semitism? It's just Jews making a lot of noise about, how badly they're being treated. Well, look at them. They're running everything. That's how people think. And no one is actually, taking it by the scruff of its neck. So I think people, it's to do with mood music. It's to do with making it unsayable, by people remaining silent, by the Jewish community being too timid, by Israel being silent for all kinds of reasons, and by the rest of society being silent. No one even knows what this thing is, let alone that it should be considered beyond the pale. So I think it could have a great impact, actually, if everybody were to stand up and say what should be being said.
Well, and break the silence. Break the silence, as you are devoted to breaking the silence. And I think your point with regard to anti-Semitism as racism, to hide it under the umbrella of racism is to feed it and encourage it. You have to establish an anti-Judaic premise in order to arrive at a racist outlook, in my view. So yes, that's an important point. It's not just racism.
No,
right?
No, it is not.
No, it has metaphysical dimensions. I have another question. I have several questions. I need to start going through them. Here's a question from one of my students, actually. Who says, Orthodox Jews say to fight against anti-Semitism, they say to fight with prayer. Is prayer feasible or not? Is it better to fight with practical reason, with knowledge, or just hope and pray through tefillah? God will change his mind, their minds.
I don't think, well, I mean, who knows? I would not like to say what practical results come from tefillah. But the idea that it alone can change people's minds, I don't think that's how the Almighty wanted us to behave. I think that what we learn from our teachings are many things, obviously, but what I've learned from them is that as far as the Almighty is concerned, he's not going to give stuff to us on a plate. we got to do the hard work. He gives us the reason, he gives us the means of doing so.
Yes.
But we have to do it. So we can't just leave it, you can't just pray and then leave it to divine intervention. That hasn't been of conspicuous help so far. We've been given, if you're a religious person, you think that we've been given, God-given gifts of reason and intellect and courage and all those things, and we have to use them. Otherwise, you're not doing the Almighty's work.
Yeah, and I think even from a traditional Jewish point of view, if all you have is prayer, you don't even have prayer. You have to act on.
Exactly.
I have a comment from a good friend of mine, Bram. It says, I have not had great success in talking to close Jewish friends or relatives who have been affected by the relativism and intersectionality with other groups. The strength of attraction to these other groups seems to be too strong to fight against. So what do you advise? What words should be used other than anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I wouldn't use, I try not to use the word anti-Semitism. It's actually very difficult to avoid it, I have to say.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think that, it is a trap, that word. How do you get through to such people? Well, I'm afraid you have to use the black arts, as I said before, that they use against us. Because I think, one thing I've learned in my long and bitter experience of dealing with my former colleagues who go in for this kind of thinking is that, what motivates them? Now, they would say what motivates them is, my heart bleeds for the suffering of the world. Okay. It's not true. It is not true. You can demonstrate easily it's not true. For example, let's take the Palestinians. Their heart doesn't bleed for the Palestinians. If they did, they would be, on the streets every day against the Palestinian Authority for locking people up, for killing them, and so on and so forth. So what motivates them? What motivates them is their belief that their whole moral and political personality is invested in a set of beliefs and values which they consider to be for the betterment of humanity. Okay, now I know that because I used to be part of all that. And so it's their Achilles heel, because what matters to them is their idea of themselves as good people to themselves and to others. That's the Achilles heel that we should be attacking. Because we have to basically do to them what they do to us, but with truth. So we have to say to them, you're a racist. You're a racist. You want the Jews alone not to have their own country. You're a racist. You support Black Lives Matter. You're a racist. You think that people should be judged by the color of their skin and not by the content of their character. That is racism. Anti-white racism, to which they say, and I had this conversation, they say, don't be ridiculous. You cannot be a black racist. And then you say, that is racism. That is racism. You are a thoroughgoing racist. And believe me, it has a terrible effect on them because they don't like it, because suddenly they become kind of, I have to get rid of this terrible label that's around my neck. Stick the label around their necks, but it's a true label. You're supporting ethnic cleansing. You're supporting Arab colonialism. They say, to be ridiculous. The Israelis are colonialists. No, the Israelis are the only extant indigenous people of the land. They say, don't be ridiculous. Then you take them through it, and their jaws hit the floor. And you say, whether they believe you, you say, you are supporting colonialism, Arab colonialism. You are supporting ethnic cleansing of the Jews from their own country. How can you? You're supposed to be progressive. Label them. And, it's very effective because what they're, the reason they subscribe to these ideas is because in all of us, there is a noble instinct to do good. They want to do good in the world. They really believe they're doing good in the world. So you have to, the extent to which the language has been hijacked to allow them to think they're doing good when actually they're doing really bad, that can't be exaggerated. So tall order, I know.
Yeah.
But basically, we have to reclaim the language so that it again describes something which is true rather than something that's false.
Yes, language, extremely important. I have a question from Dr. Kenneth Price. Dr. Price says, through courses and Holocaust museums, we've portrayed ourselves as weak and victims. Aggressors go after the weak. On the other hand, Israelis seem as strong and powerful, seem to be strong and powerful, and therefore they are attacked. Can't win.
This is correct. Absolutely. We're attacked because we're weak. We're attacked because we're strong. We're attacked because we have no country. We're attacked because we have a country. I mean, you know, whatever we do, we're attacked because we're rich. We're attacked because we're poor. I mean, it is the classic no-win situation, unfortunately. All we can do is stand up for the truth of it, whatever it is. When it comes to the Holocaust memorializing, I mean, I just think, you know, we're doing something. I mean, we of all people stand for memory, for remembering, for being true to history, and for communicating that history to the next generation, and on and on and on. This is our, you know, our sacred duty as Jews. And to me, the Holocaust memorializing has betrayed that sacred duty. It's as simple as that. There's no more or less than that. We have to get back to telling the truth about it. But you know, whether that would actually help or not is not. I think it's not quite the point. We just have a duty to the truth of it. And I do think it would actually help because, you know, I mean, Jews don't like to say this, but it is true. Jewish people are unique. And their suffering is unique. Their historic suffering is unique. And unless we're actually going to say this, we're going to fall into that trap of being judged just like any other people who come and go, who happen to be persecuted, who persecute others. You know, nothing different there. Just another form of racism, both to us and by us. So unless we actually grasp this nettle of uniqueness, which is so difficult for us to grasp, I think we're not going to make much progress.
It is difficult, but I mean, one thing we can watch out for is de-Judaizing it, right? And throwing the Jews into the category of victims in general, ignoring that what the Nazis are actually trying to annihilate, and not just Jews, but Judaism.
But I think there's another element to what your questioner has said, which I think is terribly important, which is that the emphasis on the Holocaust portrays us as victims. And I mean, that really isn't how we should be portrayed at all. Right. You know, what the world needs to know is about the Jewish people and the contribution that we make and have made to the world, and the history, and you know, the cultures that were lost, not by concentrating on what was lost, but by concentrating on what they produced. And you know, it's the wrong way around. You know, the world is obsessed by dead Jews. And the reason it's obsessed by dead Jews is that's what Jews concentrate on. And that can't be right.
Yes. We have another remark from Gail Mitchell regarding cancel culture. And cancel culture, she says, removes the voices that name the problem. And the cancel culture, the forces of cancel culture are real, in my view.
Sorry, by the voices of cancel culture, you mean what? The people who are being cancelled, or the people who are cancelling them?
The people who would cancel or silence those who would name the evil. And as you point out, if you don't name it, you can't see it.
Yeah.
And there are factions and movements that would, you know, in that so-called cancel culture, which is a culture of silencing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And, you know, it goes far beyond the Jewish people, as we can see.
Oh, yeah.
In universities, etc. But yes, it is a silencing mechanism. Absolutely.
I have one more question. Oh, actually, there are a lot more. I'm not sure we do have some time. Eldad Jacobson asks, is it possible that the official Israelis stay silent because Israelis see all through the Arab conflict, and which does not include Christianity in their thinking. In other words, are the Israelis blinded by the threat at their doorstep?
Yeah.
So they kind of turn away from progressive Christians or secular left.
Well, there's a lot in that. If you're facing what Israel faces daily, it's not surprising, that they can't be bothered with all this sort of stuff about, intersectionality and all this sort of, from their point of view, sort of nonsense going on. They're impatient about it because, they've got enough problems, put it mildly, with Iran and with the Hamas and with Lebanon and the Hezbollah. Quite apart from anything else, and their relationship with America at the moment, the Biden administration, extremely difficult. Okay, but there is another element to this which I've come up against over many years when I've said to the Israelis, why don't you say the truths? Why don't you tell the truths? Because we can't be more Israeli than the Israelis, in the diaspora. You can't be, plus royal que le roi. You can't be more Catholic than the Pope. You can't be more Israeli than the Israelis. If the Israelis are being silent, then there's only a certain amount we can do. To which the response is very telling. The response is, what, you think that we're going to be bothering with those Europeans, the graveyard of our people? What, you think we're going to be bothering with the British after what they did in the Mandate in Palestine? You've got to be crazy. To which I say, this is very wrong, because you could make a difference. Don't be ridiculous. We could never make a difference. So they have no understanding of the mindset of people beyond the region. And they don't want to find out, because partly because they are busy with other stuff, like how do we keep alive for the end of the week? And partly because they just don't understand, and they don't know what they don't know, and they won't listen, because they think it's not worth even investing in it because of the history.
Thank you. If I can squeeze in just one more, we have just a few minutes. Do you have any comments or thoughts about the Amnesty International report? I know you do. I know you have lots of thoughts about that.
In 3 seconds. Look, Amnesty is a hate group. That's the end of it. It's a hate group, should be treated as such. It should have no credibility at all. Nobody of any conscience should have anything to do with it apart from shutting it down. It is possessed by irrational and obsessive hatred of the Jewish people expressed in the state of Israel.
Wow. No.
You did ask.
I did ask, and I'm so grateful for your reply. I'm profoundly grateful for your insight. You surpassed the highest of expectations, certainly on my part. As once again, you always not only rise to the occasion, but transcend the occasion. Thank you, Melanie Phillips, so much. I'm going to turn this over to Stan for a closing remark announcement. We have a week from today, we have the 5th in a series of 5 speakers with Charles Asher Small, the founder and head of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. But Stan, do you have some closing remarks?
Thank you, first of all, to Melanie Phillips for that thoughtful, animated, direct, outspoken, and very valuable presentation. We're grateful to you, and continue to do your good work.
Thank you so much. I'd just like to jump in and say thank you. I'd just like to jump in and say I'm really grateful to you all for your time and for your hospitality, and very nice to meet you all virtually.
Good. And thank you also to Dr. David Patterson for once again organizing this and the other speakers in this program, and to our partners in the series, which include the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies at the University of Texas at Dallas, the Institute for Global Studies on Anti-Semitism and Policy, and the Southwest Jewish Congress. And we're grateful for all the people who participate and for all the participants who've benefited so greatly from that. And once again, we want to thank our speaker, invite you next week, once again, 1 o'clock, to hear Dr. Charles Asher Small on the topic, seems to be a continuing topic, confronting contemporary anti-Semitism. And for those people who are with us today, Congregation Nishmat Am is pleased and proud to present this series to our synagogue, to our community, both here in Texas, nationally and abroad. We invite you to learn more about our synagogue by visiting our website, nishmatam.org. And if you want to connect directly to us or to donate in support of these and the other programs that are presented by Nishmat Am, please write to us or call us directly, info@nishmatam.org. Our number is here. We appreciate your presence at all these events. We look forward to seeing you to many more of them. Once again, thank you, Dr. Patterson, and a great thanks to our guest speaker today, Dr. Melanie Phillips. Once again, thank you all for participating. We hope to see you next week. Thank you.
And let me just mention once more, Melanie Phillips' website. It's melaniephillips.substack.com. It's a gold mine of thought-provoking material. Thank you.